You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to episode 69 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. Connect with us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast and sign up for the newsletter on our website, socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the role of social media in protests and demonstrations in Northern Ireland, which is an interesting case. And my guest is Dr. Paul Reilly. He is a senior lecturer in social media and digital society at the University of Sheffield. And before we hop into that topic, I want to congratulate the winners of our Swag Pack giveaway, which are Osama Abd from the Media and Communication Research Department at Freiburg University in Switzerland, and Woletta McGilvray from the Institute of Political Studies at the University of Tartu in Finland. So congratulations to y'all. Swag Pack's on the way. All right. So Northern Ireland, interesting case and really topical in the media right now because of Brexit. And the issue is Northern Ireland is technically part of the United Kingdom, but about half the population, according to polls, aligns with a nationalist movement that's in favor of joining the Republic of Ireland. So it's about a 50-50 split between unionists who align with the UK and nationalists who align with joining the Republic of Ireland. So the question is, if Brexit happens, what to do with Northern Ireland? And most famously, that's called the Northern Irish question. So we're going to get into that and the deep history of conflict because of this division in public opinion, which also tends to fall along religious lines. So the unionists tend to be Protestant and the nationalists tend to be Catholic. And so there's a lot of interesting dynamics. It's a sort of ethnic, religious, cultural divide in this context, this region of about 2 million people. So it's a really interesting case to look at what's going on in terms of social media in protests and demonstrations. So just to give a bit more context, I found some stats on social media in Northern Ireland from a company called Octave Digital. And these stats are from 2015, which is around the time we're going to be looking at. So you have 65% of the population on Facebook, as well as YouTube, 40% on WhatsApp, and 33% on Twitter. So a pretty high adoption of social media in the context. But as we'll talk about in the episode, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are politically active on social media. So these are overall numbers of the population, which is again about 2 million people. And Dr. Reilly is going to share the results of some of his research that, going back to his PhD, looked at websites in Northern Ireland, how political parties were using them, how visible the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, was in Google searches. And then we're going to hone in on two protests/demonstrations. One has to do with protests around how often the Union Jack, so the British flag, would be flown at the Belfast City Hall. And the results of that research are in an article called Researching Protest on Facebook, Developing an Ethical Stance for the Study of Northern Irish Flag Protest Pages in Information, Communication, and Society. And that's interesting. We're going to talk about how Facebook was used back when I think it was more of a public space where the Facebook pages actually were a place for organizing and discussion, whereas now I think they're really fractured into different communities. But we're going to get into that. And then the second article we're going to dig into is called Tweeting for Peace, Twitter and the Ardoyne Parade Dispute in Belfast. And that is in First Monday. There will be links to those in the show notes if you want to check them out. But without further ado, let's get right into it. My guest, again, is Dr. Paul Reilly. He is a senior lecturer in social media and digital society at the University of Sheffield. Dr. Reilly, thanks so much for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks, Michael. Good to be here.
So why don't we start out with a short crash course on the Northern Ireland question, since it's so topical at the moment, and this might be a big ask, but can you give us a brief history of the controversy and why it's particularly topical right now?
Oh, good question. Essentially, there was a 30-year conflict between, on one hand, Republican movements, the IRA, professional IRA, and the British state. You also had loyalist paramilitaries who obviously wanted to preserve the union with Great Britain. Republicans, on the other hand, wanted to reunify with Ireland. This sort of came out of a civil rights movement in the late 1960s. And essentially a 30-year conflict, which would be considered by most people to be low intensity in terms of there were 3,000 people killed over 30 years. But Again, a conflict which was persistent. It was obviously sectarian. So again, we have religion in the mix in terms of it was an ethno-nationalist conflict. And then post-1998, we obviously have the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. We have a consociationalist power-sharing arrangement, which is designed effectively to bring all parties into governance. It's designed to encourage peace building, peace sharing. And within that, of course, we have Brexit. So again, we have 20 years of what you could define as relative peace, still many communities divided, high levels of residential segregation in many areas, in Belfast in particular, where there's so-called peace walls. So again, these are literal walls that divide Protestant and Catholic communities. They're still in place. We also have this issue, I think, over 20 years of perhaps a lack of democratic accountability. So again, we have the DUP. So most of your listeners will know the DUP from Brexit, I'm sure. We'll talk about that a bit later. And also Sinn Féin, who have effectively been the leaders of their respective ethno-nationalist blocs. So again, representing the two positions on the border on reunification with Ireland. And what we have had over the last 20 years, I think, is a system of stop-start governance, whereby there have been constant suspensions of the devolved Stormont administration. Most recently, we're now over 2 years without an executive in Northern Ireland, particularly 2 years where we've had the Brexit negotiations, where Northern Ireland has been, to a large extent, overlooked, its voice not heard, the DUP perhaps being mistaken for representing Northern Ireland voices on the issue. And I think the Irish border, which I think probably your question does partly allude to, not really considered in Brexit, and now perhaps belatedly the centre point, the sort of key point of contention for all these political parties, both within the UK and I think within the EU as well, where there's been no real consideration of the impact that this might have on the peace process, with some people worried that it may well return Northern Ireland to a period of violence. So again, a lot to unpack. That was a very brief crash course.
Yeah, and I think this is the first time on the podcast that the IRA is mentioned, not referring to Russian trolls. So that is somewhat welcome. But before moving into the social media side and your research, I just want to kind of rewind, because I had to go back and look a little bit into Irish politics, which has really kind of exploded. So Theresa May called this snap election for the UK in 2017, and it was kind of unexpected that the DUP came into power, right? So is that having an impact on the Brexit negotiations at the moment?
Oh, most definitely. I think part of the issue here is that, and again, even within the UK, obviously I'm living in England here, so I see the media coverage both within Northern Ireland and over here. People often mistake the DUP as representing the majority of people in Northern Ireland. They don't. I mean, they're the largest party. But in terms of representation, they're about maybe 30 to 35%. I mean, the majority of Northern Irish parties came out firmly against Brexit. And again, what has happened since that 2017 confidence and supply arrangement is that I think often DUP voices are the only voices heard when it comes to certainly the UK's position on that. And also over here, I think perhaps people often presume the DUP are speaking for the majority of citizens when they're not. So I think it has had an influence, I think particularly because and again, we had the airing of the Benedict Cumberbatch docudrama, if you can call it that, last night, which was noticeable again for not mentioning the Irish border at all. I think there was perhaps no thinking in terms of the UK governments, both Cameron and May, as to what to do with the Irish border question. So I think there is a problem there. And I think one of the things that it seems quite intractable in terms of being able to secure a seamless, frictionless border, all these words bandied around about it, but also with the UK planning on leaving customs union and the single market. I think that's one of the reasons why May's supposed compromise deal was supposed to remedy some of those things. But of course, in Northern Ireland itself, there are divisions in terms of support for that. So it's not uniformly welcomed either. So it's a very complex, protracted and messy situation, I think, because people didn't really think through what the consequences would be for people in Northern Ireland itself.
Yeah, it's super interesting for me because, I mean, we have a lot of listeners in the UK who I think would be very familiar with the Northern Ireland context. I'm personally not so familiar myself, really, until all of this controversy came around Brexit. But that's why I'm excited to ask you about your research on social media in Northern Ireland. I mean, why focus on social media in this particular context?
Well, my sort of starting point, and this is going to make me sound very, very old to your listeners, was my PhD was on websites. I mean, I have to say fairly unexciting, non-eventful websites, because back at that time, so my sort of PhD going back to my undergrad degree at St Andrews, I mean, my sort of starting point was there were a few stories about loyalist and Republican paramilitaries, terrorist groups using the internet to target people and having websites which were quite militaristic. So even in a sort of post-agreement context, there was some evidence that perhaps dissidents would use the internet as a weapon. So again, in ways that obviously when it came to my PhD, and I'm sure you'll know this from your own research, Michael, you turn up with perhaps an idea. I mean, my initial ideas were about the role of the internet in terrorism. And then, of course, most of the websites there are fairly non-impactful. They don't really have a lot of references to it. In many cases, even looking at party websites, many of the websites I looked at in 2004 or 5, so not that long ago, with literally a picture. And if you want to hear more from us, call this number or visit us in person. So nothing, no interactivity, nothing at all. And then with social media, when I sort of finished my first book, we sort of have again, this sort of 2011, 2012, we see sort of some evidence of Northern Irish parties, activists, also residents groups moving on to social media, perhaps embracing social media more than they did websites or Web 1.0, if you want to call it that too. So my sort of starting point was around 2010, 11, doing interviews with communication officers from the main political parties in Northern Ireland at that time, asking them about it. Very much all told me, yes, Obama, that's the reason why we've went on Facebook. That's why we're starting to use this. Also in that time, we do have, Arab Spring, so-called. We have the Occupy. So a lot of these sort of reference points, which I'm sure your listeners will be very familiar with, all being cited as reasons why political parties were starting to go on social media, albeit not very successfully, I think. I think in many cases it was maybe tokenism. But I think since the flag protests, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, a bit later, you really have these sort of first examples of what appeared to be mass mobilization, protests being organized, perhaps in ways that using traditional media was not possible, both during the conflict and even post-1998. And I think my sort of jumping off point was really thinking about, is this enabling new forms of digital citizenship, new ways in which people can express political preferences, their views? Or is this something perhaps yet again, which is an example of hype, an example perhaps where really people in Northern Ireland were not turning to Facebook or Twitter or YouTube to get information about politics, to engage politically? So my sort of starting off point was that. And I think there was initially some differences, I think, in terms of what I saw with websites, where they really were, I called it at one point, islands of political communication. They really were very limited in what they appeared to offer political parties or offer citizens.
And before we go into the social media aspect, I mean, I saw you had done some work on Google, which is relevant for that. Even in the early days of the internet, you still had to use, a search engine to get there. And you were looking at something with the IRA and Google and how visible they were in that space. Is that right?
Yeah, this is going back 2008. You're making me feel very old, Michael.
Well, we got to start from the back before we get to the present, right?
I think one of the things, looking at then, this is looking at Google Archie and some of the early work on that. And again, as part of my book, part of my PhD at the time, I was just looking at terms of visibility of loyalist and Republican paramilitaries, and again, whether they were visible in search engine results. And again, with many of them, they weren't very visible, perhaps surprisingly. And in some cases, I think going back to your starting point for this podcast, if you say IRA to people, that means many different things in many different contexts. And that was one of the things that in that particular study I found there was a lot of examples of these terms or these acronyms being mistaken for other organizations. So it was an interesting study now, thinking what we know about Google algorithms, about how this affects the visibility or lack thereof of political actors. And I think it's fair to say that with the Northern Irish context, you're really talking about a very small group of actors who are active online. One of the things that I've certainly found is that if you can call it Northern Ireland Twitter, I'm sort of riffing on Dean Freeland's idea of Black Twitter in terms of Black Lives Matters. Mm-hmm. It's a very small group. I once did a social network analysis of blogs, influential blogs using Node Excel in Northern Ireland. And it's a really small group of people who are talking to each other. I don't think that's uncommon, but I think it's interesting to think how, going back to the Google study, some of the same key findings from that still apply today. And that I think perhaps, while there is evidence that groups have greater presencing online, I think perhaps they're still not as active or as visible as others. And I think perhaps that reflects the fact that it's a very small place in Northern Ireland that fewer than 2 million people. And again, within that, how many are politically involved? Again, it's a minority of that. So I think that probably reflects it too.
Yeah. And I mean, even though, your work was back in 2008, here we are almost exactly 10 years later, and the same controversies are showing up around our search engines like Google shuttering conservative views or downplaying that in their algorithm. So that idea of visibility in the search engines in the so-called Googlearchy is still very relevant.
It's interesting from my perspective too. I mean, I'm thinking about obviously the conference in Copenhagen, which you and I were both at a few months ago. I mean, some of the issues about how social media renders visible certain issues in certain groups and doesn't to others apply in different contexts. I think that's one of the things that I find really fascinating, particularly when it comes to the efficacy of digital advocacy or activism, particularly thinking about in countries like Northern Ireland, or I shouldn't probably say countries, I should say contested entities like Northern Ireland, where perhaps political parties, when I spoke to them in 2010-11, would tell me frequently that it was still about, going to doorsteps, asking questions, about having, their advertising highest up on lampposts, see that the greatest visibility was still physical. And I think it shifted a bit, but I'm not so sure, again, in terms of a lot of the stuff we talk about disruptive technology and the ways in which it can empower and revolutionize, well, a lot of that is still hype. And I think one of the things that the DNA in my work, I think perhaps in social media, has always been the starting point, has been, will Facebook tell us that they create positive connections, but do they really? And I think with social media companies, they like us to hear only the positives and only the good things about what they do. And I think that's something, particularly with the Ardoin study, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later, where Twitter found that study because the headline in the press release was Twitter diffuses sectarian tension. So, I mean, that's a very attractive headline for Twitter. We're bringing people together. We're creating peace. But again, the reality for most people, how they experience social media, is always somewhat messier, somewhat different.
Yeah, and it segues great into my next set of questions, which deals exactly about some of these protests you've been working on and demonstrations in Northern Ireland. So the first I want to bring up is the Union flag protest, which were started around late 2012, and you were looking at how Facebook was used in those protests. So can you give us a bit of context to those protests and what you were looking at there?
Sure. This will be another very brief description, so excuse all the nuances I'm probably going to miss in this. But I think with the Union flag protests, again, the timelines are December 2012, I think the 4th of December 2012, around that time, there was a vote in Belfast City Council to change the Union flag protocol. So essentially, if you're ever in Belfast, I do recommend you all go, obviously. It's my bit done for tourism. There is a Belfast City Hall is in the centre of the city. It's a very old building, but the Union flag had previously flown all year round. And again, an equality impact assessment conducted on behalf of the council had suggested that should change to reflect the fact that, again, that nationalists and Republicans were not represented by that flag. And again, looking for perhaps either two flags or no flags to be the solution. And a compromise was agreed by the council, which was that it would fly only on 18 designated days. These were things like royal family weddings, birthdays, things like that. There was a very visible and angry response by working class loyalists. These are, again, groups who believe in the union with Great Britain, again, who see their identity as British, who see the flag very much as a symbol of that. And what that prompted, again, in early December 2012, were mass street protests, weekly marches to and from Belfast City Hall itself. Again, a lot of disruption, particularly around Christmas in 2012. There was active efforts to disrupt traffic, to disrupt trade. I think at the estimate of police costs and costs to the local economy in the millions. So again, a lot of impact of this. And the key sort of perhaps the media coverage at the start, and again, we find this a lot with other examples where perhaps the role of social media is overstated, was very much, well, Facebook was being used to, fuel or to power or to energize these protests. And my sort of starting point in December 2012 was to think about, well, A, is that true? And B, what, if anything, are these Facebook pages? What role are they playing in these protests? Is it what is being claimed by the media? Or, as in the case, as we've seen since, perhaps these are spaces in which people contest facts, contest issues, and argue a lot about the causes of it. And again, a lot of loyalist pages were public, were open. So again, as a researcher, that obviously provides some opportunity to get an insight into what they were being used for. But also on the flip side of that, it gives people an opportunity to obviously argue with those responsible for the protests. So it becomes really a space in which there is a lot of sectarianized and antagonistic exchange between supporters of the protests who are out in the streets and those who support those out in the streets and those who are critical of them. And again, the loyalist Facebook pages at the time, there's a lot of examples of hate speech. Again, in my work, I collected posts from one page, which was actually eventually shut down and reopened as a backup page due to threats against an unidentified man that were made on the page, which caused the police and the courts to get involved. And there are examples of hate speech. There are examples of what you could crudely define as trolling, where people do come on the page to have a go at loyalists, to say, why are you doing this? To challenge this culture war narrative, which is something which really revolves around the Fly protesters seeing their identity as being chipped away at, being eroded by what they see as a Sinn Féin-led conspiracy. So they very much had a view that the police, who they refer to as the PSNIRA, in reference to the IRA, were part of this conspiracy against their identity, were part of their loss of identity, which they felt was a result of the peace process. So these Facebook pages very much become a space in which often sectarian, often hostile, often antagonistic exchanges occur, where the victim mentality perhaps that loyalists have, and again their perceptions of their identity being eroded, are played out perhaps in ways which, going back to what we talked about at the start, it's sort of rendering visible things that perhaps aren't being articulated in the news media, on TV or in newspapers. So it's interesting just to think of Facebook providing a platform for people to air grievances, but at the same time, they are also using it to share information about protests, about locations. And of course, if you're a critic of it, or someone who is a Christmas shopper in Belfast, for example, you can see the same information on these pages too. So people start sharing information about where protests are and the times with other people. So it becomes a way for people to avoid disruption as well. And again, there's quite a lot of to unpack in terms of this idea of building up a victim mentality, about conspiracy theories, about rumors. And again, that's where obviously a lot of the most recent work on social media and activism and protest has went. But thinking at that time about how people would share stories like, I've heard from a friend that members of the Garda Síochána, so the police in the Republic of Ireland, are in Belfast, and they're the ones who are policing our protests. So again, no evidence to support it. Something which gets floated on a Facebook page. It's a text-only comment. Someone says, I've heard this. And of course, this sparks other sort of rumors and think people sharing information which is not being fact-checked, which is not correct, which then, in the case of that one, does actually eventually lead to the then Justice Minister, David Ford, having to go on camera and say, this is not true. Again, I can confirm we're not asking the Garda Síochána to help with this, and it's not true. And almost having to refute what was an online rumor or I think misinformation would be the way I would categorize it too. So you started these trends back in December 2012. And I think it's interesting to think about how that might, again, we're familiar with more sophisticated attempts to perhaps deceive or manipulate. But, we see there are some early signs of how people reporting things which they can't substantiate can lead to various other fears, insecurities, and this victim mentality manifesting itself.
Yeah, and even an official political response. But listening to you talk, I'm thinking about what Facebook was like back in late 2012, early 2013. And if I recall, it's hard to keep track of these fast-moving targets, but if I recall, the pages back then were more like community groups.
Yeah.
So like, we saw in the with the sort of Russian trolls in the US election, they were creating pages and then sort of promoting content that way. But if I have it right, wasn't it in 2000, around that time period where the comments were much more of a public forum than kind of being just shuttered under page posts as they are today?
Yeah, good. I mean, again, there's some evidence of certainly moderation of it, but you're right to say that these were fully public. And again, in many cases, you have people on the page, and we've had evidence since. So there's a really good study by Queen's University in Belfast in 2014, where they interviewed people who were involved in the flag protest movement and asked them about social media. And their response was, we didn't trust it. So again, even though social media was being linked to their movement, being seen as very intrinsic to it, that they very much had the view that it was more harm than good, that very much the information they saw on it, they didn't trust either. So they were moving more towards text messaging and less public ways of communicating about it. So I think the part of the issue with moderation, though, again, as a researcher, and it's probably a different discussion altogether, is that there's a lot of moderation, as in a lot of comments deleted. So when you're looking at these pages, at the time, I used Discover Text to collect data on this at the time as well. A lot of comments removed and a lot of warnings from moderators, which I thought was quite interesting, was that looking at December to around March 2013, particularly after that legal case where the main loyalist page had been shut down, you have a lot of warnings about do not post content which constitutes hate speech, people actually trying to actively police these pages. And a lot of comments that appear to have been removed, presumably by these admins of these pages too. So some efforts there already to try and structure and control and perhaps regulate what's on them, but not an effort to make them private or to go to a more private space, even though there was some evidence perhaps that loyalists themselves were increasingly distrustful of information posted online. So I think, you're right. I think it's the architectural problem again, I think, in terms of this, that perhaps with people moving more towards closed groups, you would lose, perhaps as researchers or even as citizens, some degree of insight into what was underpinning those sorts of movements, because the lack of media coverage of these grievances to that point wouldn't have given you an insight into why. Again, I think that's probably another thing that social media makes visible in that way too. And Twitter, obviously, again, we've a more fully public platform, perhaps, where even though it might not be representative, we do get an insight into what people thought of these sorts of movements too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of racking my brain thinking about the stuff that you were looking at back then is still quite relevant today in terms of all the talk about, the spread of false information or misinformation, however you want to categorize it. But I think a great example of that is from the Ardoin parade disputes, 2014, 2015, where you were looking at Twitter and found some interesting examples of this kind of disinformation and fact checking within the community. So can you go into that? And
Sure.
Yeah, especially this "Love Thy Neighbor" placard. I think it's a great example.
Yeah, I mean, again, this was the Northern Ireland Community Relations Council project that I worked with an independent researcher, Honor Young, on at the time. And again, I think it's one of those projects where, when we proposed it, that we sort of found things that we perhaps didn't expect. I mean, I think our sort of working assumption at the time, because Orna was looking at interviewing members of communities affected by contentious protests and the marchers themselves, whereas my role was looking very much at Twitter. With the Twitter stuff, what was interesting, just looking at, tweets tagged Ardoin, was that, again, you'd expect there to be a lot of news media coverage and representation of it, and certainly that was evident. A lot of journalists, effectively, to give a brief background to Ardoin, this is a contentious parade where it goes through a main arterial route in North Belfast. In previous years, prior to 2014 and 15, the 2 years that I've looked at, there were a lot of violence, particularly, again, when the parade was allowed to go through. There would be incidents where nationalist residents from Ardoin would riot, would clash with the police. And then when the parade was rerouted from 2013, you have the marchers, the loyalists, the Orangemen and their supporters also involved in clashes with the police as they wanted the parade to go past the Ardoin.
What is the parade actually about?
It's an Orange Order parade. So in Northern Ireland, there's the annual 12th of July demonstrations where members of the Orange Order, so again, it's a Protestant organisation, they have an annual parade where they celebrate the Battle of the Boyne. So again, from 1690, where King William of Orange defeated the Catholic King James. And again,
jeez, it's going back a while.
Yeah, people have long memories in Northern Ireland, as I'm sure it's probably self-evident for anyone who knows anything about marching season. There's a lot of conflict in some isolated pockets. I think it's important to sort of stress that very few parades have that level of violence or unrest around them. But I mean, certainly Ardoyne was a constant flashpoint. And our sort of rationale for looking at it was thinking very much about if social media was being used to inflame tensions, as had been suggested by some earlier work, this would be an area where you'd expect it. And again, certainly again, thinking about the Twitter stuff that I was doing at the time in 2014, the Love Thy Neighbour one's a really good example. And it's one that's a very neat visual illustration of how unsophisticated and how perhaps some crude photoshopping might well inflame tension, but also might be well easily called out by people who do not want to inflame tensions around a contentious parade. This was essentially a picture that one, presumably a loyalist, circulated, which was a picture of a banner which basically said Orange Order banned and had a symbol, like a picture of an Orange Order man with an X through it, basically saying they're not welcome in this area. And essentially it was, as Michael will testify, really obviously photoshopped, very crudely photoshopped. And somebody else, again, on the Twitter stream, what you find with Ardoyne, like a lot of events, hybrid media events, is that people often use Twitter to follow news in real time. So around the Ardoyne parade, there's a level of that too, I think, where people do follow what's happening to see if anything's happened, and hopefully things pass off that incident. Other people noticed quite quickly that the same picture, the same group of protesters had been captured by a professional journalist, the BBC journalist, Kevin Sharkey, where it clearly said, "Love thy neighbour," and it was, again, a Christian protest calling for peace. And they challenged the person who, again, had made that effort to deceive, to inflame tensions. And again, number of shares of that. And again, it's important to point out, there were very few shares of the original image, the photoshopped image. And it was one of several examples where certainly I think it's fair to say that these are crude, unsophisticated attempts that weren't very successful by virtue of the fact that they weren't shared a lot, albeit, and I'm caveating this by suggesting that, again, people sharing that image on Facebook, on private Facebook pages, or via other means may well have believed it was authentic. But certainly at the time there was that. There was a Randallstown bonfire, which again, essentially Oscar Knox was a 5-year-old who had died from a rare form of cancer. And there was on the morning of the 12th of July parades in 2014, there were images circulated or claims of people saying there's a picture of Oscar Knox being burnt on a loyalist bonfire. So the night before the 12th of July, loyalists have an annual bonfire. And again, this prompted a lot of controversy. And of course, the actual people who built the bonfire, the Randallstown Sons of Ulster Flute Band, they were on Twitter. So again, they were able to respond directly to this by saying the image that's circulating showing this is fake. It is photoshopped. And here is an image of our actual bonfire. Now, that actual bonfire had tricolours and other things on it, which again, most people consider quite reprehensible, burning national flags and all the rest too. But they shared that to say we would never do that. And then it was a photojournalist, I believe, who had taken the image which had been photoshopped. His image was shared, showing that there was actually a picture of a bonfire from several years ago, which had been doctored. So again, we have a quite quick, rapid response to efforts where people are presumably trying to inflame tensions around the parade, perhaps to cause violence or to cause nationalist residents to go for the police, or loyalists to go for the police itself. So we've all these sort of efforts to do it, which superficially perhaps look unsuccessful. But I think the caveat to that, I always sort of say this when we think of single platform studies, is that I can sit there and say that in terms of Twitter, that people shared an image who used the word Ardoyne in it in terms of this, obviously. So there's an issue there about the sample. Might not have shared it, might not have believed that. But of course, we don't see what other people did with that image and how it was shared, and whether it was shared using different keywords or it was shared offline. And again, I think it's important to stress that, again, this was based on how Northern Ireland Twitter responded to it, that it didn't appear to have much traction.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, as you're talking about this long memory and these kind of deep-seated cultural divisions in Northern Ireland. Thinking back, just because it's very topical at the moment, these yellow vest protests in France that are going on where, the role of social media is looked at, or even going back to the protests in the Middle East in 2011. I mean, do you think that there's something about the Irish cultural context that makes these protests and, the spread of these doctored photos something that's particular to that case?
I think it's a good question. I mean, I think certainly I would advocate a contextualized approach towards social media and activism is essential. And I think, again, particularly one that goes across more than one platform is crucial. One of the things that I think is important to do, certainly in my work, in the book I'm writing now, completing now, is that I've looked at the news media coverage as well as looking at Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And I think that does give you a much clearer and broader picture of social and political trends and how they play out both on and offline. I mean, I think, certainly looking at the specifics of the Northern Ireland context, I mean, one of the things that certainly I've been sort of playing around with quite a lot recently, particularly after our Copenhagen conference, was this idea of Northern Ireland, I think, has a long history of propaganda being deployed, particularly, again, by the British state versus the Republican movement, by various paramilitaries or terrorist groups and their political organisations as well. So, I mean, I think people in Northern Ireland perhaps have an awareness about the role of propaganda and again, perhaps a cynicism or skepticism, depending on their viewpoint about information from those sources. And again, we have some data which does suggest that perhaps that does translate into perhaps Northern Irish citizens, for whatever their background, being more skeptical of information posted online. I think that's fair to say. Another layer on that perhaps is that in a society transitioning from conflict with perhaps a high level of democratic dysfunction, baked into the cake in terms of power sharing being mandatory, not voluntary. So again, people in elections, and again, there have been some evidence perhaps in the last 10 years that turnout is declining. I think because many perhaps people look at it and think, well, whoever I vote for, they'll be part of the devolved assembly, the executive power in the region. So again, for a lot of people, perhaps there isn't an accountability there. But you have a context perhaps in which mis and disinformation, information disorder, whatever you want to call it, has more opportunity to thrive online because perhaps people do feel very dissatisfied with politicians, particularly in the last 2 years where there hasn't been an executive at all. There's been no assembly. So again, for many people, they do feel that issues like Brexit, their voices haven't been heard. So I think there are specifics, certainly in the context where I think the Northern Irish political and media culture does perhaps lend itself to social media being used in certain ways. I don't think it perhaps has the revolutionary capacity that perhaps more optimistic accounts would have. And I think one of the things that was interesting looking at some of the events that certainly I've spoken at in the last couple of years is that people who are very positive about social media often say, well, you only talk about negatives. And again, I think there's an issue there about reflecting that a lot of people's experiences of social media in the context of Northern Ireland is not Ardoin and parades. It's not mis and disinformation. It's something very different. It's very personalised. Thinking of yellow vests, I mean, again, what's interesting about that to me is that I'm sure you've seen the news where in the UK, certainly the yellow vest protesters have been harassing MPs like Anna Soubry and been linked to things in the UK, which I think are very distinctive from perhaps the French protests and where yellow vest protests have been elsewhere in Europe. I sort of wonder again about this issue about how social media, often we see protest groups, advocacy groups, any kind of political activism on those platforms. It borrows from others. I think often, I'm thinking back to Dave Karp's work on this, thinking about Move On. I think often, and with my stuff in Northern Ireland, equally thinking about how Obama was mentioned by every person I spoke to in 2010. That was the reason why they wanted to do it. Mm. They see bits that work and try to apply them in that context. Again, it doesn't often seamlessly translate. And I think it's important that in some contexts, obviously, it probably won't work. But I mean, I think often what we see with these groups is they borrow from what has worked elsewhere. And they do try and apply it in that context, albeit that it may not bring the same level of success or efficacy as seen elsewhere. And I think in Northern Ireland, my sort of big question, I suppose, is that thinking about digital citizenship critically, thinking of Lena Denchik's work in this area, I do wonder whether, again, this idea perhaps that if Northern Irish people are using social media for political information, for activism, it isn't automatically a good. I do sort of wonder again about the fact that when we think of surveillance, we think of what we know about various data scandals. I mean, it may not entirely be positive, and also it may distract from the sort of face-to-face discussions, the negotiations, perhaps the compromises which need to be made on the ground, which obviously aren't, for whatever reason, possible on Twitter or on a hashtag or on Facebook groups, which tend to be more antagonistic in debate.
Yeah, and I mean, when you're talking about protests in a contentious context, of course, there is that, as you can't divorce the context from the the use of the technology. But you mentioned your second book you're working on, and from what I was reading online, it is about promoting positive community relations through social media in Northern Ireland. Are you finding that, or is it really this kind of this battlefield of different opinions and different narratives?
I think for this, my sort of starting point was perhaps a critical one. I mean, I think going back to 2012, I mean, we have projects like Peace on Facebook. I don't know if you've heard of that one, or the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab, and some of the early, very optimistic, perhaps, unverifiable projects which said, well, we can create positive connections in divided societies. Now, interestingly, Northern Ireland wasn't one of those. I mean, it was very much about other contexts, like Israel-Palestine, for example. But my sort of starting off point was very much thinking of the contact hypothesis. So this is a conceptual framework often applied to Northern Ireland, thinking about how Catholics and Protestants, nationalists, unionists, loyalists and Republicans, could perhaps find ways to acknowledge, again, perceived grievances, also to come to some sort of accommodation on issues which divide them. And at the time, in 2006, there was some early work which said ICTs could perhaps provide one aspect of this, where it could be, for example, I think it was email at the time, that perhaps if you had people from different communities who did not spend time face-to-face, you could start that gradual model of intergroup contact using email and ICTs. So my starting point for a lot of the work I've been doing the last 6 to 7 years was very much, well, would that work in Northern Ireland? Again, with websites, obviously very little evidence from my PhD. Looking at social media, clearly we think of incidental exposure, for example, and think in ways in which people, I'm not going to critically unpack the echo chamber thesis here, but clearly it's fair to say it's been overstated by a lot of people. And I think perhaps the media have also been guilty of sort of falling into that trap of presuming that. And Twitter, I mean, I can look at the hashtags that I've looked at and do see a lot of homophily. I do see a lot of perhaps, people having confirmation bias from other people on hashtags, which really don't challenge their views on those things. I think the flag protests in Ardoyne, to a certain extent, I think the fact that these are people who have the same political views is reflected in that. My sort of questions, and again, these are things I'm sort of tackling at the minute, are that, is it better that most people in Northern Ireland have perhaps the opportunity to participate in hybrid media events and talking about political issues on program hashtags and things like that I watch, than the previous situation, so during the conflict, where you have 3 main newspapers in Northern Ireland and people didn't really have the same platform and didn't really feel they had the opportunity to do it. And I think at the minute I'm probably skeptical about that. I think in terms of peace building, rendering visible certain forms of activism, certain viewpoints, I mean, for most people, they would say it's probably a positive. I suppose my question mark is, in the flag protests, we see a lot of discussion and perhaps deconstruction and perhaps mocking of a victim mentality, a culture war narrative, but no real issue to address the causes of it. I mean, I think very much, almost in some cases, it was being held up as something to poke fun at, as something that should be dismissed, as something which was paranoid, a conspiracy theory, something which wasn't true. But it didn't address the reasons why people felt like that. And I suppose my concern is that if you have lots of people talking past each other or antagonistically engaging with members of the other community or people with different political persuasion or faith, they're probably not coming to any sort of compromise on that. And again, my sort of question mark is, where is the political leadership? Because I think clearly in Northern Ireland at the minute, there is a political vacuum. And there is evidence of people being increasingly alienated and disillusioned with their representatives. And I suppose you want peace to be built and consolidated, you need to have political leadership of both communities, of every community being represented, and also addressing the conflict legacy issues and the issues of contentious parades, protests. They need to be doing that and doing that in a more forceful and active way. So I'm skeptical, but I'm certainly not, I wouldn't say it's impossible that, for example, people having that incidental exposure cannot be a good thing in the future. And it might well be a way that people do learn more about what other communities think, particularly in a deeply divided society.
And my last question for you is, I mean, do you think that that is something that relates to all the different groups and interests in Northern Ireland? Or do you, and the reason I ask is the way that intersects with how these platforms are built. Like Facebook is built around community pages. So it's very conducive to, for lack of a better word, tribalism or this kind of homophily through hashtags. I mean, in order to be less critical, would you say that these platforms have to change their kind of core design in some way? Or do you think it has to come from, as you mentioned, the political leadership or the citizenry itself?
That's a good question. I mean, I suppose, again, I do come back to that idea, but what do social media companies have to gain from people perhaps engaging in more positive inter-community dialogue in Northern Ireland? And again, going back to that example of Ardoyne, the media headline said Twitter diffuses sectarian tension. Twitter liked that a lot. Again, the Twitter referred to that as a good news story for them. I think arguably, like Facebook, social media companies want good news stories. So I think that's where, I mean, my curiosity about, peace on Facebook as a concept was very much that, and this is my social science researcher skepticism or cynicism coming through quite loudly. Surely that was, again, something which was PR, and they couldn't substantiate it. My sort of feel on it would be that often, particularly look at hashtags around events, hybrid media events, as Chadwick talks about, is that the nature of those exchanges reflects the context in which those exchanges occur. So particularly around Brexit, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be familiar with, there's often a very toxic commenting culture on Twitter around, certain hashtags, around certain debates. And Northern Ireland is no different from that. And I think it's important to stress that there are certainly parallels in terms of how people respond to what they see on their TVs. In Northern Ireland, it could be about the lack of political accountability, about various scandals. And again, there have been quite a few in the last couple of years which have eroded public trust in institutions. How they're handling Brexit, another key part of it too. So I do think it's context about political accountability and leadership. And I do kind of wonder, should we expect social media companies to change their architecture to encourage positive community interaction? I think they probably would do it if it was profitable to them. And I do kind of wonder, again, if Northern Ireland had a boycott Facebook and Twitter campaign where there was perhaps active resistance towards social media, only at that point would they perhaps think, well, we should change the architecture and the way in which we encourage rapid response and quite emotive and effective responses to comments posted online. So I'm not so sure they're likely to change soon. And I think, again, the prognosis in terms of restoring Stormont and getting that political accountability back doesn't look good, certainly in the short term.
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating context. It's something that, again, I knew about but hadn't really read into, and reading your work was kind of enlightening to see what's going on in Northern Ireland and the role of social media in it. So, Dr. Reilly, thanks for coming on the podcast and sharing your insights with us.
Thanks, Michael.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Paul Reilly, Senior Lecturer in Social Media and Digital Society at the University of Sheffield. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, we're going to have Dr. Homero Gilde-Zuniga on the show to talk about his News Finds Me perception, which is super interesting, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, you can swing over to socialmediaandpolitics.org and sign up for the newsletter. I'm going to put out a new one of those pretty soon. But as always, it's been a pleasure. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.